The boardroom was dead silent. 23 executives, investors, and department heads sat frozen in their leather chairs, watching a man they'd feared for decades completely lose control. John Brown's face was crimson, veins bulging at his temples, his finger pointed like a weapon across the mahogany table. His voice cracked the air like thunder. "You are fired! Get out of my building, now!" The target of his rage wasn't an incompetent executive or a failing department head. It was Eleanor Brooks, the 61-year-old woman who had sat outside his office for 32 years, managing his calendar, organizing his files, and keeping every single secret this company had ever held. The woman everyone called just the secretary. But what John Brown didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that Eleanor Brooks wasn't just anything. She was about to say 7 words that would destroy everything John had built his identity around. 7 words that would strip away the illusion of power he'd worn like armor for 3 decades. And those 7 words were going to change everything. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to Money Stories That Matter channel to always get new stories about ego collapse and instant karma. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not to that explosive boardroom confrontation, but to 32 years earlier, when John Brown was nothing more than a desperate man with a failing business and an ego too big to admit defeat. It was 1993. The financial landscape was brutal, unforgiving, and eating ambitious young entrepreneurs alive. John Brown was 42 years old, recently divorced, living in a studio apartment that smelled like cheap coffee and broken dreams. He had started a mid-sized financial consulting firm 3 years earlier, with money borrowed from every friend, family member, and credit card company foolish enough to trust him.
The company was called Apex Financial Solutions. The name was bigger than the reality. John had vision, charisma, and the kind of aggressive confidence that made people believe he knew what he was doing. But vision doesn't pay bills, charisma doesn't cover payroll, and confidence definitely doesn't stop creditors from calling every single morning before sunrise. By September of that year, Apex Financial Solutions was 60 days away from complete bankruptcy. The dozen employees John had hired were already updating their resumes. The office lease was 3 months overdue, and John Brown was sitting in that cramped studio apartment, staring at foreclosure notices and wondering if he should just walk away from the whole disaster. That's when Eleanor Brooks walked into his life. She wasn't young. She wasn't glamorous. She was 39 years old, recently widowed, wearing a modest gray suit she'd owned for 6 years, carrying a worn leather portfolio and a quiet determination that most people mistook for submission. She had responded to a classified ad John had placed in desperation. Executive assistant needed, experience required, immediate start. The interview lasted 11 minutes. John barely looked at her resume. He needed someone, anyone who could answer phones, manage the chaos, and work for the embarrassingly low salary he could barely afford to pay. Eleanor needed a job. Her husband had died 8 months earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving her with a mortgage, medical debt, and a 21-year-old daughter finishing college. They shook hands. She started the next Monday. For the first 3 months, Eleanor did exactly what John expected. She answered phones. She organized files. She managed his chaotic calendar and made sure he showed up to meetings on time. She was quiet, efficient, invisible, the kind of employee you forget is even there until something goes wrong.
But Eleanor wasn't just organizing papers. She was reading every single document that crossed her desk, every contract, every financial statement, every angry letter from creditors. She was learning the business inside and out, understanding the problems John was either too proud or too scared to face. And she was making a decision that would change both of their lives forever. In December 1993, Apex Financial Solutions officially ran out of money. The bank rejected John's 4th loan application. 2 major clients had just terminated their contracts. The landlord was threatening eviction. John sat in his office, a tiny room with peeling wallpaper and a view of a brick wall, with his head in his hands, accepting the reality that he had failed. Eleanor knocked on his door. She was holding a folder. Her expression was calm, almost serene, which seemed bizarre given that they were all about to lose their jobs. "Mr. Brown," she said quietly, "I have a proposal." John looked up, exhausted. "Unless your proposal involves a miracle, Eleanor, I'm not interested." She sat down without being invited. She opened the folder. Inside were financial documents, projections, and a check. A personal check made out to Apex Financial Solutions for $275,000. John stared at it like it was written in a foreign language. "My husband," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "was an engineer. He had a life insurance policy I only discovered after he died. It's been sitting in an account because I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt like I'd be spending his life." She paused. "But I've been watching this company. I've been reading every file, every report. This business has potential, Mr. Brown. Real potential. You just need capital and better financial management." John couldn't speak. His throat had closed up.
"I'm willing to invest this money," Eleanor continued, "but not as a loan, as an equity purchase. I want 51% ownership of Apex Financial Solutions. You remain CEO. You keep running operations, making decisions, being the face of the company. I stay as your assistant. Nobody needs to know about this arrangement, but legally, I become the majority owner." John should have been offended. His ego should have exploded at the idea of his secretary owning his company. But he was drowning, and she was offering him a lifeboat. He didn't hesitate. They shook hands. Papers were signed by Friday. By Monday morning, creditors were paid, the lease was current, and Apex Financial Solutions lived to see another quarter. And Eleanor Brooks became the invisible owner of everything John Brown would spend the next 3 decades taking credit for. Here's what happened over the next 30 years. John Brown became a legend. With Eleanor's capital infusion and her silent, meticulous management of the company's actual operations, Apex Financial Solutions didn't just survive, it exploded. By 1997, they had expanded to 3 cities. By 2001, they were managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. By 2008, while other firms were collapsing in the financial crisis, Apex weathered the storm because Eleanor had quietly insisted on conservative investment strategies that John publicly took credit for. John's reputation grew with every success. He became known in the industry as the aggressive, visionary CEO who turned a failing startup into a financial powerhouse. He gave speeches at conferences. He appeared on business news channels. He was featured on magazine covers with headlines like "The Man Who Wouldn't Fail" and "Brown's Golden Touch."
He wore $15,000 suits. He drove a midnight blue Bentley. He had a corner office on the 42nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He had assistants who had assistants. He cultivated a reputation as the guy you didn't cross, tough, demanding, ruthless when necessary. And through it all, Eleanor Brooks sat at the desk outside his office, managing his calendar, organizing his files, and keeping her mouth shut about the truth. People saw her as furniture. She was always there, always efficient, always invisible. Junior executives didn't know her name. New hires assumed she'd been with the company forever because nobody remembered when she'd started. John himself rarely acknowledged her beyond barking orders or demanding coffee. But Eleanor saw everything. She knew which executives were cooking the books. She knew which deals were legitimate and which were built on John's ego rather than solid financial ground. She attended every board meeting, sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes that she filed away in a system so organized it would make a library jealous. She never complained. She never demanded recognition. She cashed her modest paycheck, a salary that hadn't increased substantially in 20 years, and watched as John deposited massive CEO bonuses into accounts funded by profits her investment had generated. You might be wondering why. Why would someone with majority ownership of a multi-million-dollar company pretend to be a secretary? Why would Eleanor Brooks let John Brown take all the credit, all the money, all the glory?
The answer was simple, and it was written in that original agreement they'd signed in 1993. Eleanor hadn't wanted power. She'd wanted security. She'd wanted her daughter to finish college without debt. She'd wanted to honor her husband's memory by building something lasting. And she'd believed, perhaps naively, that John Brown would grow into a leader worthy of the opportunity she'd given him. She was wrong. The cracks started showing around 2019. John was 61 years old. He'd been the public face of Apex Financial Solutions for so long that he'd completely internalized the myth of his own genius. He stopped listening to advisors. He overruled financial analysts. He made impulsive decisions based on gut feelings and ego rather than data. He acquired a competitor for an absurdly inflated price because he wanted to make a statement. He invested heavily in a cryptocurrency venture that senior analysts warned against. He fired 3 department heads in 1 week because they'd questioned his judgment during a board meeting. Eleanor watched it happen. She raised concerns, quietly, in private, the way she'd always done. John dismissed her. "You're my secretary, Eleanor, not my business partner. Just do your job." By 2024, Apex Financial Solutions was starting to struggle. Not catastrophically, but noticeably. The third quarter showed declining revenues for the first time in 15 years. 2 major clients pulled their accounts. Industry publications that had once praised John Brown were now publishing articles with titles like, "Is Apex Losing Its Edge?" John's response became to be more aggressive, more controlling, more publicly hostile. He berated executives in meetings. He blamed departments for failures that stemmed from his own decisions. He created an atmosphere of fear, believing that intimidation was the same thing as leadership. And then came the board meeting on October 15th, 2025.
It was supposed to be a routine quarterly review. 23 people gathered in the main conference room. Board members, major investors, department heads, and the usual collection of executives who attended these meetings to look important. Eleanor was there, as always, sitting in her designated chair near the back wall, tablet in hand, ready to take minutes. John opened the meeting with forced confidence, presenting third-quarter results that were objectively terrible. Revenue down 18%, 2 major clients lost, profit margins shrinking. His presentation was full of excuses and finger-pointing. The marketing department hadn't executed properly. The sales team was underperforming. The CFO had missed opportunities. Nobody was buying it. Marcus Chen, one of the longest-serving board members, and a man who'd invested 8 figures in Apex over the years, interrupted John's presentation. "With all due respect, John, these aren't departmental failures. These are leadership failures. You overruled the strategy committee on the Silverton acquisition. You personally championed the cryptocurrency investment against unanimous analyst recommendation. You've created a hostile work environment that's driven away talent." The room went silent. Nobody talked to John Brown like that. Not in public, not in front of investors. John's face changed. The carefully maintained CEO mask cracked. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the edge of the presentation podium. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Are you questioning my leadership, Marcus?" "I'm questioning your judgment," Marcus said calmly. "And I'm not alone. We need to discuss bringing in outside consultants to review operations and potentially restructure executive decision-making." That's when John exploded.
"Restructure?" His voice rose to a shout. "This is my company. I built this. I turned a failing startup into an industry leader. Every success we've had has been because of my vision, my decisions, my leadership." He was pacing now, gesturing wildly. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't executive confidence. This was a man losing control. "You want to bring in consultants? You want to question me?" John's face was dark red. "Maybe the problem isn't my leadership. Maybe the problem is incompetent people who can't execute my vision." His eyes scanned the room, looking for a target, someone to blame, someone to publicly punish so everyone else would fall back in line. His gaze landed on Eleanor, sitting quietly in her corner, tablet in hand, the same place she'd sat for 3 decades of meetings. And John Brown made the biggest mistake of his life. "You know what?" he said, pointing at Eleanor. "This whole meeting is a disaster because someone didn't prepare the materials properly. Someone didn't coordinate with departments. Someone has been dropping the ball for months, and I've been covering for her out of loyalty." Eleanor looked up from her tablet. She didn't speak. She just looked at him with those calm, unreadable eyes.
I've kept you on for 32 years, Eleanor, John continued, his voice dripping with condescension. 32 years, out of loyalty to a woman who's become too old and too slow to keep up with a modern company. But I'm done making excuses. The room was frozen. Several executives were staring at their hands, mortified. John walked toward Eleanor's corner. He was performing now, reasserting dominance by publicly destroying someone who couldn't fight back. You're a dinosaur, Eleanor. You've been coasting on my generosity for years. Well, that generosity just ran out. He stopped directly in front of her chair. Eleanor sat perfectly still.
And then John Brown said the words that would destroy him. "You are fired. Clean out your desk and get out of my building." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Eleanor carefully closed her tablet. She set it on her lap. She looked up at John Brown with an expression that wasn't angry or hurt. It was something else entirely. Something that made several people in that room suddenly very uncomfortable. "No," Eleanor said quietly. John blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Eleanor stood up slowly. At 5'4", she was considerably shorter than John's 6'1" frame, but somehow, in that moment, she seemed taller. "You don't have the authority to fire me, Mr. Brown, and this isn't your building." John laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Are you having a breakdown, Eleanor? Security is one phone call away." "Call them," Eleanor said calmly. She walked to the conference table, opened her leather portfolio, and pulled out a folder. An old folder, worn at the edges, that she'd carried to every single board meeting for 32 years. "But before you do, there's something everyone in this room should see." She opened the folder and pulled out documents, legal documents, old legal documents with signatures and official seals. "December 1993, Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. Apex Financial Solutions was 60 days from bankruptcy. Mr. Brown had exhausted every source of capital. The company was about to collapse. She placed the first document on the table. "On December 10, 1993, I purchased 51% of all company shares using a $275,000 personal investment. This contract, signed by Mr. Brown and notarized by Douglas Chen of Chen & Associates Legal, made me the majority owner of Apex Financial Solutions." The room exploded with whispers. Board members leaned forward. Marcus Chen picked up the document, his eyes scanning it rapidly.
John's face had gone from red to pale. That was just a temporary arrangement. You know that was temporary, Eleanor." "Show me where it says temporary," Eleanor said. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. "Show me the clause that voids this agreement. Show me the document where I sold my shares back to you." She placed another paper on the table. "You can't, because it doesn't exist. I have been the majority shareholder of this company for 32 years. "This is insane," John said, but his voice had lost its power. "You're my secretary." "I was never just your secretary," Eleanor said. "I was the person who saved your company. I was the person who provided the capital that kept this business alive. I was the person who sat in every meeting, read every report, and watched you take credit for 30 years of work built on my investment." She pulled out more documents, financial records, ownership certificates, shareholder agreements, every piece of paper that proved exactly what she was saying. Marcus Chen was reading through the documents with the intensity of a man watching his entire understanding of reality shift. Other board members were pulling out phones, presumably calling lawyers. Several executives had gone pale. "You let me believe," John started, then stopped. His whole body seemed to be collapsing inward. "I let you run the company," Eleanor corrected. "I let you be CEO. I let you have the spotlight and the credit, because I genuinely believed you would grow into a leader worthy of the opportunity. I didn't want power, Mr. Brown. I wanted security for my daughter. I wanted to honor my husband's memory. I wanted to build something lasting." She closed the folder. "But you didn't grow. You became a bully who rules by fear. You make reckless decisions and blame others for the consequences. You've created a toxic environment that's destroying the company I saved." She paused. "So no, Mr. Brown, I'm not fired. I'm not cleaning out my desk, and this isn't your building." The silence was deafening. John Brown opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. He looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone who would support him, validate him, tell him this was all a misunderstanding. Nobody met his eyes. Marcus Chin set down the documents. "These are legitimate," he said slowly. "Eleanor Brooks has been the majority shareholder for 32 years. John, you've been operating as CEO under her ownership this entire time." Another board member, Patricia Williams, spoke up. "If these documents are valid, and they appear to be, then Ms. Brooks has the authority to make executive decisions regarding company leadership." She looked at Eleanor, "including removing the CEO." Eleanor didn't move for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I don't make decisions impulsively, unlike some people. This requires a proper board vote and legal review. But yes, given Mr. Brown's demonstrated poor judgment, hostile behavior, and the financial damage his recent decisions have caused, I will be recommending his immediate removal as CEO." John made a sound like a wounded animal. "You can't do this. I built this company." "I saved this company," Eleanor corrected. "You managed it, and lately, you've been mismanaging it badly." She turned to the board. "I'm calling for an emergency session to address leadership concerns. We can reconvene tomorrow morning with legal counsel present." The next 72 hours moved with brutal efficiency.
Legal teams verified the documents. They were absolutely legitimate. Every signature was authentic. Every filing was proper. For 32 years, Eleanor Brooks had been the legal majority owner of Apex Financial Solutions, and nobody except the lawyers who'd filed the original paperwork had known. The board met in emergency session. The vote to remove John Brown as CEO was 14-2. The two who voted against it weren't even defending John. They were concerned about market perception of sudden leadership change. By Friday afternoon, John Brown was escorted from the building. No dramatic scene, no shouting, just security guards, a banker's box with his personal items, and a walk through a lobby full of employees who'd once feared him and now just looked away uncomfortably. His company car was already reassigned. His corporate credit cards were canceled. His email access was revoked. Within 3 days, the man who'd believed he owned everything walked out with nothing but the severance package the board legally owed him and the shattered remains of his identity. Eleanor Brooks was named interim CEO, not because she wanted the title, but because someone needed to stabilize the company, and she was the only person who actually knew how everything worked. The news hit industry publications within a week. The headlines were brutal. Apex CEO ousted after ownership revelation. Financial executive learned he never owned his own company. The secretary, who was actually the boss. John became a cautionary tale. Business school professors used his story as an example of ego overwhelming judgment. Leadership consultants cited him as a warning about toxic management. The man who'd once been featured on magazine covers was now featured in articles about spectacular corporate failures. But here's what happened to Eleanor Brooks. She fixed the company.
She didn't want to be CEO permanently. She never had. But she spent 8 months cleaning up John's mistakes, restructuring departments, repairing relationships with clients John had alienated, and rebuilding the company culture he'd poisoned with fear. She brought in a new CEO, a woman named Jennifer Park, 47 years old, with a stellar reputation and a collaborative leadership style. Eleanor stepped back into an advisory role, where she'd always been most comfortable. She kept her small office. She still managed schedules and coordinated meetings. But now everyone knew who she really was. The woman who'd saved Apex Financial Solutions 32 years ago. The woman who'd owned it all along. The woman who'd proven that real power doesn't require shouting or intimidation or corner offices. Real power is knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of, and never needing anyone else to validate it. So what happened to John Brown? He tried to start a consulting firm. It failed within a year. He tried to write a book about his experiences building a financial empire. No publisher was interested. He did a few podcast interviews where he tried to spin the story as if he'd been betrayed, but the documents didn't lie, and nobody believed him. The last public information about John Brown placed him in Phoenix, Arizona, working as a mid-level financial advisor for a regional firm. No corner office, no Bentley, no magazine covers. Just a 66-year-old man who learned too late that borrowed power isn't the same thing as real power, and that ego is a poor substitute for character.
Eleanor Brooks retired at 68. She sold her majority stake in Apex Financial Solutions for an amount that was never publicly disclosed, but was rumored to be in the hundreds of millions. She bought a house in Vermont near where her daughter and 3 grandchildren lived. She spent her days reading, gardening, and occasionally consulting for businesses that needed someone who actually understood how to build something lasting. She gave one interview to a business journal where she was asked if she regretted staying silent for 32 years. Her answer was simple. I didn't stay silent. I just didn't waste my voice on people who weren't ready to listen. And when it mattered most, when I finally did speak, every word counted. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about power and ego and the people we overlook, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button for money stories that matter. This channel exists to tell the stories that reveal deeper truths about ambition, success, and what really matters in the pursuit of wealth. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever worked for someone like John Brown? Have you ever known an Eleanor Brooks, someone quietly powerful who everyone underestimated? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide between seeking credit and actually getting things done? And here's a bigger question. If you were Eleanor, would you have stayed silent for 32 years? Or would you have claimed your power earlier? There's no right answer, but I want to know what you think. This is Money Stories That Matter, where we dig into the stories behind financial success and failure. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next story, where money, power, and human nature collide in ways you won't expect. Because the best stories aren't about people who had everything. They're about people who understood what actually mattered all along.